I want to say something at the start of this episode that I don't say lightly. They say a week is an eternity in politics, and as such, I am genuinely worried. Not anxious, not cautious, worried. In a way that someone who's been in business for some 40 years, who's watched cycles come and go, and knows the difference between a difficult market and something that feels structurally different, knows that worried actually means.
Okay, that's not your usual opening.
It's not.
Okay, so what's changed?
In the week, I was listening to a couple of finance and news programs, and the commentators were discussing the Labour leadership race, which is all over the news. And one of them said, and this sort of just stopped me in my tracks. They said, if the party moves further to the left, we could be talking about conditions not seen since the 1970s.
Oh my, that really landed.
Yeah, landed like a Mike Tyson right hook, to steal a boxing analogy. I was young in the 70s, very young, but I remember the atmosphere. I remember the carnage. I remember the sense that something was fundamentally broken and nobody in power knew how to fix it. There was hatred in the air. And I use that word deliberately, the class war that played out, not just in parliament, but on the streets and in the communities and in whole industries. I remember it so vividly, and I remember the damage it left behind. Names like Arthur Skygle, I remember him standing high up, speaking to his coal miner workers, shouting and screaming. During that time, there were bombings as well in Manchester, in Birmingham, in London. There was so much stuff going on. The country was in trouble.
I think the question for today, Paul, is do you think that we could really go back to that?
The question is, what happens to property? What happens to landlords? What happens to the private rented sector? What happens to all those things if we do? And what do you do about it if you're sitting on a portfolio right now, watching this unfold, feeling like nobody in the conversation is speaking to you directly? We're going to try and do that today without flinching. I'm Paul, Director of Essential Management, and this is the Essential Property Podcast, the version where we say out loud what everyone is thinking.
And I'm Amanda, and today my job is to ask the questions that every landlord sitting at home would actually ask, including those really uncomfortable ones.
Especially those. Let me start up with the structural argument. I'm like a bit of an economist now for my sins. Before we get to 1970s inflation and miners' strikes, I want to lay out what I think is actually happening right now today to the private rented sector. The government cannot build enough social housing. The state can't build enough social housing. It hasn't been able to do that for 30 years. There's no credible plan that changes any of that. The waiting lists are at historic highs. The stock just isn't there.
So what does the government do in that scenario?
I think it does what governments always do when they can't fund a policy objective directly. It legislates the private sector to deliver it. It creates obligations, security of tenure, controlled eviction grounds, implied rent limitations through political pressure, even when there isn't a legal cap in place yet, licensing requirements, decent home standards, HHSRS inspections. Every single one of those is a public service obligation dressed in private sector clothing.
I hear you, but those things aren't unreasonable on their own, because I guess you'd want tenants to have security, you want tenants to live in properties that are decent.
Yeah, I'd want all those things too. That's not the argument. The argument is about what happens when you stack all of those obligations onto a private sector without compensating them for the public service function they're now performing. If you look at other sectors, water's gone downhill, the supply of water, just some of our other utility services. People are continually complaining about our utility services because there are private companies that have to be, or quasi-utilities basically. And I think that's a bit of a problem.
And so what you're basically saying is that the PRS is going down that same track.
Yeah, I'm saying the incentive structure is identical. And when you regulate the return on private capital below the rate that justifies the risk, capital flees, not dramatically, not overnight, one landlord at a time, one portfolio at a time, and one I'm done with this conversation at a time. And then one day the supply is gone and the government discovers that the sector it spent a decade criticizing, and it has been pretty much a decade, was actually housing 4 million households. And the people who needed it most are the ones left with nowhere to go.
It's crazy when you look at it like that. You think what the government are thinking, but it's a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, but it's a pattern. I'm not predicting the future. I'm just reading the pattern.
Do you think we're being too OCT with this, or do we really think that property is going to go down that same road where we're just so constrained by the government?
I think the writing's on the wall. I think when was the last time you received an email or read a newsletter and it said, good news, the government is doing this for landlords?
I know.
When's the last time?
I know.
And the question nobody's asking loudly enough is, if the private landlord is now expected to deliver a public service, why are they being treated as a tax target rather than a public service provider? You don't regulate the NHS into insolvency and then act surprised when the waiting lists grow.
That's so true when you look at it like that, in terms of being forced to provide that public service on a shoestring, providing the country with 4 million households, but bootstrap it. That just sounds like setting yourself up to fail from the very beginning. But I guess that's the Labour government all over.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. To a lesser extent, some of it was started by the Tories as well. Labour was just coming and said, this is our thing, equality, and we don't like people making lots of money. Landlords don't make lots of money. I wish that were the case. I wish it was easier. But let me just zoom out a little, because I think the reason government is doing what it's doing, the reason it's conscripting private landlords into public service delivery is that it has no other choice. And the reason it has no other choice is the underlying economic picture is worse than people are saying.
And what do you mean by worse?
I've still got my economist hat on. Real wages, i.e. taking account of inflation, in the UK have barely moved in 15 years. Not in absolute terms, in real terms, when you adjust for inflation. A generation of workers have effectively stood still financially, while asset prices, property included, has gone up significantly, which means the gap between people who own assets and people who don't has widened in a way that is structurally significant.
Okay, so that's like a two-nation problem.
Exactly. And when you have a society where a large and growing proportion of people cannot access home ownership, not because they're feckless, but because the maths generally doesn't work, then renting isn't a phase, it's a permanent condition. And government has to do something about permanent conditions.
Some more renters, more demand for social housing, more pressure on the government to act, but the landlords have to carry the weight of that. I just can't see how that's fair.
That's a chain, Amanda. The more people renting permanent means political pressure to regulate renting, and that becomes existential for government because those people also vote, and they vote on housing, and they're angry, which is why the direction of travel on regulation is not going to reverse regardless of who is in government. The underlying demographic pressure doesn't care which color is in Downing Street.
But the intensity of the regulatory response might change depending on who's leading from the front.
Yeah, and that's a question we'll get to. But first, I want to talk about whether any of this is actually new, because I think I've seen this movie before, albeit 50 years ago. Right now, the nation is getting poorer. There's no celebration of economic growth. We see headlines like the economy grew by 0.1% last quarter.
It's
That's not
embarrassing.
growth.
It's embarrassing.
Absolute embarrassment. So 40 years of business, I've never felt like this in terms of that cloud of doom and gloom. And whilst I'm a glass half full type of guy, it's becoming a little bit tougher to motivate myself and see through this gloom and doom. A lot of effort that I could be redirected in doing something a little bit more positive in other ways. Anyway, I want to ask you a question. Answer it instinctively before we work through the evidence.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Go on.
If you purchased property in the 1970s through the 3-day week, something that you probably don't know that much about because you weren't around in the 1970s, but manufacturing and workers only work for 3 days. So if you purchased property in the 70s through that whole 3-day week scenario, through inflation running in the 20% levels, through the IMF having to bail out the UK, through the winter of discontent, through miners' strikes, Arthur Scargill, and that sense that the whole country was coming apart, would you be better off or worse off today than the average flat cap miner who put his faith in his union and his industry?
Okay, so I wasn't even a thought in my parents' mind in the 1970s. So that's a bit of a heavy question. I'm almost too scared to answer it. It feels a bit political.
It is. And the reason I'm asking it is that that the 1970s, that's how the 1970s felt to many people living through them, like the worst possible time to make a long-term financial commitment. Inflation was destroying savings. Industrial action was constant. Political instability was in your face. If you were a working person trying to decide whether to buy a house or trust the system, you'd always been part of the pit, the union, the community. The decision just wasn't obvious.
Okay, so what's the answer then? Because you've got the property buyer versus the union entrusted miner. So 50 years on, what happened?
Property won by an enormous margin. Not because they were smarter, not because the 1970s weren't genuinely terrible, but because the asset held its value across the cycle in a way that the industry, the pensions, savings just didn't. The miner who trusted their industry, their jobs went. The communities went. Pensions were inadequate. The political protection they were promised evaporated when the political wind changed. Arthur Scargill was wrong, not because his anger was unjustified, but because he misread which side of history he was standing.
And the property buyer who bought in, say, 1975, through all of that carnage, won.
Yeah, that property buyer is sitting on assets that has multiplied in value many times, paid for by someone else's rent in most cases, inflation protected because bricks and mortars have a relationship with inflation that savings accounts just don't. And that is not an argument for being complacent about what's coming. It's an argument for understanding what kind of asset we actually own.
Finally, I guess a little bit of positivity in and among all of the carnage and the storm, because even when the country is in the doldrums, investing into something that will be able to ride through it, I guess gives us a glimmer of hope. And as investors, obviously that's all good. And I guess we want to encourage others, even if it's homeowners, first-time buyers, anyone thinking about getting into property in some capacity, that you can ride through the storm with it. But if you don't have it, then you're just open to the elements, is the best way that I would describe it.
Some of the fastest growing countries were the ones that were rebuilt after the war. If you look at a place like Manchester, Manchester was bombed to death by the IRA. And in terms of Manchester becoming the second city after London, if you go through it, you can see what's happened. Ironically, Andy Burnham has presided over a lot of that new investment. But through carnage, there's normally always a silver lining. But the landlords most at risk right now are not the ones who are going to be destroyed by regulation. They're the ones who are going to panic sell into the market where the buyers know that they're scared. The 1970s didn't destroy property. The people who sold in the 1970s destroyed themselves.
Crikey, that's quite harsh. But if you believe that what happens in the past generally happens in the future and everything is cyclical, now's the time to be holding strong.
Yeah.
You don't want to be a miner.
But no,
Hashtag
absolutely.
don't be a minor.
Absolutely. I'm going to come up with a crazy example. I remember in the 70s, my parents are Jamaican. I remember listening to my father talk about the carnage that was also going on in Jamaica, which with a change in government, the government was moving to also to the left. And there was a lot of looting, lots of riots, and a lot of the wealthy people that had these amazing houses up in the hill just fled. It was like, take my house, I'm off. And 10 years later, those houses up in the hill that people bought during that carnage were worth probably 5 times the pre-carnage prices.
Yeah.
People sell in panic.
Yeah.
People think the worst. They don't think long term. And it doesn't matter whether it's here or in different parts of the country. I remember post 9/11 or post crash, there were articles you could pick up apartments in Florida for the same price as buying a car for $25,000, $30,000. It doesn't matter where in the world you are. We're in the UK, so we're focused on the UK. So let me switch gears a little bit, but still related. There's something I want to name that most people in the current AI space race are careful not to say.
Okay.
The miners did lose their jobs because they were bad at mining. They lost them because the economic case for their industry collapsed and the political will to sustain it totally disappeared. The technology and the economics moved on, the communities didn't. I think we're doing that again right now with AI.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. We're building AI agents. We're the people doing that.
I know, and that's actually why I should say it rather than leave it unsaid. We are automating functions that people currently do for a living. Stan handles tenant communications that a human used to handle. Our CV scanning replaced a task a human used to sit and do. Alma is going to do team reviews that a manager used to do. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's real. And the people whose functions are being automated are not abstract statistics. They're people with rent to pay and families to feed and identities tied to the work that they do.
How does that sit with you? Because I got asked a similar question the other day in and around loss of the workforce and AI replacement jobs. And I have a personal view on that. How does that sit with you?
I think we're going through change. And if there's one thing that is ongoing that you can depend on, and it's change, just like the miners, some of those jobs will be redirected. Some of those people will be redirected to other sectors, as long as they are happy to be retrained or maybe move. Wales jumps to mind. A lot of the people in the mining industry just didn't want to move. And as such, things weren't great in Wales for a very long time. Some people say things still aren't great in Wales. So the legacy of that, not being flexible, not being retrained, still sits there. In our own situation, we're introducing AI agents, but we're retraining our team to do other things, more high value things, and enabling us to pivot into areas where we could offer more value to our landlords, to our tenants, to grapple with more things and offer services outside of the business that we didn't normally do. But here's where it connects directly to a portfolio. If AI displaces a significant number of mid-skilled workers, call center staff, admin roles, logistics coordinators, the kinds of jobs that currently pay enough to rent a decent room in Stoke, Birmingham, wherever, your tenant base changes. The people who could afford 5, 6, 700 a month can now only afford 4, 5, £550 a month. Or they fall out of the private rent entirely and go into housing benefit. That is a direct yield risk that most landlords have modeled yet.
Okay, so AI displacement feeds directly back into the PRS. That makes sense. It feeds into that argument of the government kind of controlling the private rented sector.
Exactly. Less affordability, more social housing on demand, more political pressure on government to act. And government responds the only way it knows how, by leaning harder on private landlords to absorb the shortfall. The chain is connected. I don't think rents will crater. I want to be clear on that. Displaced workers don't disappear, they reskill, as I said before. They move sectors, they adapt. But the process takes years and not months. And during that transition, they'll still need somewhere to live, just at a lower price point. This is probably where HMOs come in. So you get rental compression in the market rather than a collapse, which actually squeezes the landlord in the bracket harder than a crash would, because the asset value holds, but the yields erode.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a whole bunch of people in property who they just need to embrace the pivot. That's the best way that I would describe it. It's not about exiting, it's about pivoting. I can't even imagine how many times we've used that word pivot, Paul, over the last 10 years in our industry.
Yeah.
You can't sit still. You reminded me the other day of that book, Who Moved My Cheese? Maybe the cheese is moving and maybe we just need to move with the cheese, not to leave the mousetrap entirely. That's kind of what comes to mind for me.
I think the other thing, if you want to go really out there, there's talk on talk, and again, people don't want to accept this, but at some point you'll be walking down the street and a robot's going to be walking in your direction.
Yeah.
Someone's going to be walking a robot dog in the not too distant future. You'll be going into supermarkets and robots will be serving you in the supermarkets. So here's my question, and don't laugh at this. Where do the robots live? I said, don't laugh. Where do they live? These robots are going to belong to somebody. They're going to be care robots. They're going to do domestic stuff. And yeah, you could put them out in the garage, or they're going to be in your home. There is always going to be demand for homes, always going to be demand for space. We live on an island. The island isn't getting any bigger. But there you go. A slight twist.
I'm fully up for being a landlord for the first robot HMO. No drama with the tenants. The robots will probably pay us in crypto.
Here's the thing, and we laugh at this, and it is somewhat funny. But when we deployed AI agents, sometimes we do get some upset tenants who are quietly screaming at an issue that hasn't been resolved, that it's been missed or we messed up on or something like that. We don't get a knock on our door or a message from Stan saying, I can't take this anymore. I don't like the words of play. This person has spoken to me. We don't get that. If you have AI robots wanting to sign a tenancy agreement, show me your bank account, show me you've got the money to pay for it, and you can go straight in.
Crazy, but I think these are the conversations, like you say, that nobody wants to have because either they're a bit embarrassed to have the conversation or they're scared to have the conversation. But the reality is we are in a space of massive change. And I think the more that we talk about it, one, we can spot the opportunities within it. And two, we can also maybe get ahead and pivot of any kind of downside that's come in as well. And I think the successful investor in this day and age in property is the person that is lean, that's on their toes, and that can spot an opportunity, not the old traditional landlord waiting for the cheese to come back.
You're right. And we're brainwashed, just the way society is structured, to think in 12-month cycles, birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries. And it's difficult for us to think 10 years. Just before we started this podcast, I said that one of our investors did our first JV with us 10 years ago. And he now wants to exit, which is absolutely fine. It was a 5-year lockup, but he's lasted 10 years. And it's done exactly what it's supposed to be for him. He's got nice capital gain. He's had income all the way through that 10-year period. And even though he was optimistic, he wished and hoped that this would be the case. But it's difficult for people to look 10 years from where they are now. Anyway, let's move on.
Yeah. Okay, so just go back to the 1970s. I woke up this morning and all over my social media is pictures of Angela Rayner. Is she going to make the move? Is she going to be the next PM? In the 70s, Thatcher was the response. Let's hope Angela Rayner is not the response this time. But what do you think will be the response this time?
Thatcher didn't come from nowhere. She arrived because the existing order had failed so visibly that the electorate was willing to try something radical, something that broke with the consensus entirely. The conditions for that kind of break are building again. The institutional trust is gone. The polarization is real and hardening.
So we have to think about who or what is going to arrive next.
It could be a political figure. Reform is the obvious candidate on paper, but I'm not sure the equivalent is purely political this time. There's another possibility that the radical response isn't a party at all, that it's a generation of operators who look at the system that's failing them and decide to root around it, build their own compliance capability, build their own intelligence layer, stop waiting for the political system to fix things, and build the capability to operate regardless of what it does.
That's literally what we're trying to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's literally what we are doing. But here's the landlord-specific version of the Thatcher question. Because Thatcher's response to the 70s, including right to buy, which moved enormous amounts of social housing stock from the public sector, stock that was never replaced, stock that is now mostly in private hands. And it's part of why the current housing crisis is as acute as it is.
Okay, so Labour's equivalent of right to buy is what?
This is where I have to hold my nose. It's from landlords, not from councils. That's been mooted. That's the possible direction. Compulsory purchases at below market rates to rebuild the social stock, which is horrifying to me. Local authorities already have compulsory purchase order powers. The proposed reforms to compensation would reduce what landlords receive below market value. There are already pilot acquisition schemes running. The direction is visible if you know where to look.
That really does scare me, to be honest, Paul. What would be our defence from that?
I knew you were going to ask this question, so I thought I'd just do a little bit of research. I think there's two things. One that is underused, and that's Article 1, Protocol 1 of the European Convention of Human Rights. The right to peaceful enjoyment of possessions. It doesn't prevent the state from interfering with property rights, but it does require that interference to be proportionate in the public interest and the subject of fair compensation. The CPO at below market rates has been successfully challenged on those grounds before. It's not a guaranteed defense, but it's a legitimate one.
Why am I only hearing about this now? The next time I've got a HMO officer breathing down my neck, can I just quote Article 1, Protocol 1? Let me enjoy my possession and stop coming to inspect my properties.
If only it was that easy, if only it was that easy.
But on a serious note, what makes that challenge stronger or weaker?
How you've operated. Courts are significantly less sympathetic to compensation claims from landlords with poor compliance records, unresolved maintenance issues, unclear documentation. The best legal defense against compulsory acquisition is operational excellence, which is not a legal answer, it's an operational one.
Yeah.
On our side, we're creating regulations, Mabel, maintenance control, and they aren't just tools for running the business. They're the evidence base, every compliance record, every maintenance log, every documented tenant interaction. That's your case file if it ever comes to that type of dispute.
Yeah. I was speaking with a lawyer the other day, and she said that when it all is said and done, judges do generally take a practical view of a situation. So to confirm what you were saying, have you done 99% of things right? Yes, you have. Has something gone wrong? Okay, let's take the practical review. It wasn't intentional. Something happened. And I think that's what you're saying, isn't it? Aim for excellence, do the best that we can. That's our only way to protect ourselves. And those that are intentionally dodgy and corrupt and not doing things, really, they're the ones that judges are supposed to take a view on and say, look, you just don't care.
Yeah, I think compulsory purchase order and right to buy from landlords is slim in terms of being able to bring that into being in the UK. But when you look out and you look at a scenario, even a 2% chance of something happening should be looked at if you're overly focused on. And I think what you want to ensure is that if there's a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is compliance stuff, documentation, that you plug that vulnerability to make sure if there was the slimmest chance that someone's going to come knocking at your door and say, we're not having this and we're taking away your property or we're fining you, because a £40,000 fine is not that different to them saying, we're taking your property. You got to find that £40,000 from somewhere.
Yeah, and you might not even have 40,000 equity in the house, let's say.
Absolutely.
I think even if this is very unlikely to happen, what annoys me a little bit, and I'm ranting now, is just the fact that it's being spoken about. It starts to create a little bit of an attitude and a sentiment within the government and local authority, as if we can, if you don't do something, I'm going to take that off you. I'm in control of your house. I'm going to sell your house. You can't do anything about it. Oh no, that's not how I roll. So I guess that's the bit that sort of irritates me a bit, that there's this superiority within perhaps the government that you take all the risk, they're your assets, but we're coming for them. That really doesn't sit with me, Paul. It really doesn't.
I think you're right. And I think that's the attitude that they have. There's a phrase that we use that traverses business and politics and crime to an extent. It says, follow the cash.
Yeah. Follow the money.
Governments don't have money. They need to go and find money by any means necessary. You combine that with trying to garner a vote to win an election. That combination is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Anyway, I want to introduce a framework that puts everything we've talked about into a longer context. Because one of the most disorientating things about the current moment is that it feels random. The polarization, the institutional breakdown, the sense that things that used to work just don't work anymore. It feels like something is just gone wrong. A couple of guys, Strife and Hal, wrote a book called The Fourth Turning. And I read the book a couple of times. And I remember when I had COVID and I lay there on the bed, totally out of it. And I put it on Audible. I listened to it again. And it's fascinating. And the argument is that history moves in roughly 80-year cycles, 4 generations roughly, 4 turnings. And the character of each turning is predictable. The fourth turn is always a crisis, an unraveling of the existing order that forces the construction of a brand new one.
Okay, so you're saying we're basically in one now?
By their reckoning, yes. The last one ran roughly from 1929 to 1945, the Great Depression through the Second World War. Each one felt to the people living through it like the world was coming apart. Each one produced a new institutional order on the other side.
That's either deeply reassuring that it's a pattern or deeply terrifying that we're going to be in this thing for 15 years. Where do you sit?
I think it's both. I think the reassuring part is that the cycle does end. The unraveling has a purpose. It clears the ground for something new. The institutions that fail in a fourth turning need to fail because they'd stop serving the people they were built to serve. The terrifying part is that the fourth turnings are genuinely destructive. The clearing is not gentle, and the polarization we're living through right now, the institutional distrust, the sense that the other side isn't just wrong, but actively malevolent. That's a signature characteristic of a fourth turning. It was expected. It is in a horrible way functional because you cannot clear the ground without the friction that makes people willing to let go of what was there.
It's almost like a hurricane. You know, in the Caribbean when the hurricane comes and it wipes out and there's devastation. And we've been to many islands after a hurricane. But what grows back is delicious. The greenery, the lusciousness, a little bit like COVID when we saw the trees and the parks and the fresh air because everything had been wiped out. But it's a bit scary, to be honest, Paul.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I read something this morning from my hometown of Birmingham, and somebody was pulling down one of the St. George's flags from a pillar, and a van came and knocked the guy over. Because you knocked the guy over.
What?
Yeah. I ended up in hospital, broken leg. And this is the destruction that we're living through now, probably to get worse. Time will tell.
Okay, so let's just bring it back to our subject matter. So in and among the fourth turnings and the destruction and the disaster, what does that mean for us who are holding property right now?
Shelter survives every fourth turning. The need for housing doesn't go away. What changes is the institutional structure around it, who provides it, on what terms, under what regulatory framework. The operators who survive the fourth turnings are the ones who adapt to the new institutional order rather than defend the old ones. The landlords, most of the risk, are the ones who were viable only under the old rules, who needed that Section 21 to make their model work, whose margins couldn't absorb a compliance burden, who were relying on the tenant relationship being essentially ungoverned. The question is whether the rules will change, which they will. Question is, let me repeat that. The question isn't whether the rules will change, because they will. The question is your portfolio structured to be viable regardless of what those rules are.
Yeah. So I guess during this time, if we were to take something away from this, it's portfolio review,
Yeah.
portfolio analysis. When we say that it's only the amateur landlords that are exiting the market,
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that you can't sell one or two of the dead weights.
Yeah.
If you look at your, let's take example, you have 10 properties on your review, there might be one there that's just a bit risky. Okay, cut it loose, time to go. Maybe we strengthen up some of the ones where the cash flow is borderline. Maybe we do a family let or a social housing just to underpin some cash flow. So it's about, I think, taking a pragmatic approach, reviewing what you have and trying to stabilize it a bit, rather than that maybe perhaps emotional rapid response of I'm done, I'm out, because I don't really know what purpose that serves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the thread running through all three of those questions is the same. The disruption is real, it's structural, it's not going away. And every single risk we've just described has the same defense. Not hoping for the rules don't change, not lobbying for the old system to come back, but building an operation that can survive whatever comes next.
Okay, Paul, so I'm going to ask you something now about something that you did in the 80s. Okay. You mentioned before that you'd done something, and I wanted to just explore that a little bit.
Oh, I think that was the put contract.
Okay, so you're going to need to break that down from the beginning. What do you mean, the put contract?
In the 1980s, there was a general election brewing. And at the time, there was a real possibility, a genuinely priced in possibility in the stock market that Labour would win the election. And if Labour won, one of the things on the table was nationalisation. The Thatcher government had bought in the privatisation of British Gas, British Telecom, and people from that era would remember that. I remember my mother buying shares in those institutions. I was quite young in terms of building up a small stock and shares portfolio. I looked at my portfolio and I looked at the political risk, and I made a decision that I think was rare at the time for someone so young that wasn't working in the city. And I decided to price the risk rather than just worry about it. So I purchased a put contract, which is a financial instrument that would pay out if certain things happened, specifically if the shares of privatized utilities fell sharply, which is what nationalization would have done. If Labour got in and nationalized, I'd make a considerable return on that position by holding that put contract.
Okay, so for those of us that are not stocks and shares savvy, let's say, you're effectively hedging your bets.
Yeah, I was hedging. I wasn't predicting, I was hedging, not gambling on a Labour win. I was saying there's a real possibility of a scenario that damages my portfolio. And rather than hoping it doesn't happen, I'm going to take a position that profits if it does.
Okay, we are anxious to know what happened. We're waiting, bated breath. Did you hedge? Did you make money?
Labour didn't win, and as a result, the put contract expired worthless. And my portfolio was in good shape because the outcome I was hedging against didn't actually materialize.
Okay, so does that mean you lost money on the hedge?
I lost the cost of the hedge, which is not the same as losing money. The position did exactly what it was supposed to. It was like insurance. It gave me optionality. It meant I could watch the election with my hands without my hands going cold because I had a plan for both outcomes.
Okay, I get that. So if we relate that back to property, I don't think people genuinely think like that in property. I think it's more of a hold, hope and pray strategy rather than active portfolio management. Just like you and I would go into our pensions or into our stocks and shares accounts and we would look to move things around based on the markets. Landlords don't seem to do that. They just buy it and hope forever that it's going to be okay. So are you saying that we need to be actively looking to move things around and hedging a little bit, protecting the downside, still being optimistic for the upside and doing a better job of asset management?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think there's risk management involved and you're planning and restructuring to take that into account to minimize the risk on that portfolio. on a day-to-day basis or a year-by-year basis, we may decide that if we have 50 properties in our portfolio, and let's say 5 run social housing type contracts or charity type contracts, we might decide to increase that 5 to 10 just to offset any changes on the private rental side. So it's just reviewing. We might switch an HMO into a single let. We might sell a couple, take the cash and pay down that debt just to reduce our loan to value somewhat. So it's just managing risk somewhat.
Let me just give you an example of that I had this week, Paul, of student landlords, because student landlords are going through this in real time in terms of their cheese is moving, and the ability to have students for 10 or 12 months a year is basically gone. So I have 2 landlords right now, both with student let property in Newcastle under Lyme. Okay. One of them, pre the 1st of May, probably about 4 or 5 months before May, switched, converted them into professional HMOs. In fact, he's got 2 properties, a 5, 2 6 beds, converted them into professional HMOs. Felt uncomfortable for him at the time because he was very much used to that confirmed student income. Moving into the professional HMO made him feel a bit uncomfortable, but he made the switch. The market has well received his properties. They're good quality. They're rented. He's getting good income. He's got to manage his costs a little bit because he's not used to the bills included where the students were paying the bills previously. But all in all, he has pivoted, taken sort of my instruction. I was guiding him a little bit on what to do, and he's moved with the cheese. The other landlord has student property in Newcastle under Lyme, is complaining that they're not going to likely have their 10 or 12 month student period, that the students can just leave when they want. And is moaning about that and is thinking of maybe just selling and throwing the towel in. So that is 2 identical landlords with different mindsets, different ways of managing the risk and managing their houses to get completely different outcomes. And in the moment, I just thought, wow, what a stark contrast. And that goes to exactly the point that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Those are great examples. And I think the reason I'm telling you this now is that we're in exactly that kind of moment. You've just outlined a landlord or 2 landlords that are in that. And it's always like the who moved my cheese moment.
I think you need to do a book review on Who Moved My Cheese because
Yeah,
it's so relevant right now.
Absolutely.
So relevant.
But there's a real possibility of significant political shift. The direction of that shift has direct implications for property. And the question is whether you're sitting there hoping it doesn't happen or whether you're thinking of what you do in both scenarios.
Yeah. And most people are hoping for change.
Yeah. Hope is not a strategy. Hope is
No,
not a strategy.
it's not.
Let me be clear before we go into this a little bit deeper. From a political standpoint, I'm not telling you or telling people who they should vote for. I'm not saying Labour is bad, Reform is bad, or I think politics in politics and they do whatever it takes to get votes. When I did the book contract in the 1980s, I was looking at all scenarios and I was looking to manage my risk. So we have a few scenarios that we're moving into sort of right now. If the leadership moves significantly to the left, and that could be Angela Rayner, who seems to be supporting Andy Burnham, who is not an MP, he's a mayor up in Manchester. But anyway, the policy direction becomes much more interventionist. Rent controls become a realistic possibility. They're already in places like Scotland, already been trialed in some councils. Eviction grounds tighten further, maybe beyond Renters' Rights Act. Licensing expands. The political language around landlords becomes hostile in a way that has direct operational consequences. And if the financial commentators are right, if we're talking about conditions not seen since the 1970s, that means the risk of inflation return, interest rate volatility, maybe worst case scenario, compulsory purchase order expansion, and a fundamental renegotiation of the relationship between private capital and housing.
And that's a scenario that stopped you when you were listening to the radio the other day, just thinking about what if this does happen?
Yeah, that was the motivation for putting this whole podcast together. That's the scenario. And I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm saying it's possible. And possible is enough to plan for.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody the other day at an event, And they said to me, Amanda, May the 1st of the Renters' Rights Act isn't the end of all this. It's just the beginning.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't take on that point of view, because I thought, surely we've been through the mill enough. What do you mean it's just the beginning? But I guess that's what you're saying, because whilst people are saying Keir Starmer's not done a good job for landlords in the property sector, what if we go even further left, which I think is what you're talking about? What if somebody just wants to take that to the next level? It
And
does it does worry.
we live in a democracy, so people can table it and have a discussion about it.
Yeah.
I think scenario B, which is the centrist view, which is where Starmer is, he's seen as a bit of a centrist, is that renters' right beds in, the sector adjusts, limited new legislation for 2 or 3 years, while the government tries to focus on house building. Not comfortable, the Renters' Right Act obligations are real, and the compliance burden is real, but manageable. You know what the rules are, and you can price them in.
Yeah.
Supply contracts further. Rents rise to reflect reduced stock and increased operating costs. Yields stabilize for operators who are left. And the landlords who professionalize survive. The ones who didn't have already left or about to.
But there's pivoting because new rules come in. So you plan, prepare, price it in, and go again. But if things keep changing, it's like you're going to be on a carousel. We're just going to be spinning and pivoting, but never quite actually bedding in the change. And I guess that just becomes very chaotic, and you can't really plan. I wonder what your put contract is, Paul, just for pure chaos.
I think welcome to the world of politics. Politicians are used to that, but businesses are. And that's when, if you look at the stock market, hates uncertainty.
Yeah.
Hates chopping and changing, because businesses like to plan. They like to plan medium and long term. Not this week, this was in, next week it's gone. If you look at the flip-flopping that Trump does in the US with tariffs, it's absolutely crazy. But this is where we are. Let me mention, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's a bit like after the Liz Truss budget.
Yep.
And it just sent the markets into flux.
Totally. Now let's move on to scenario C, which is pressure from the right. If reform or a repositioned Conservative Party creates significant electoral pressure, I think there's a scenario where housing policy pivots towards supply side thinking. Build more, regulate less, restore some landlord incentives to keep capital in the sector. Some Renters' Rights Act provisions come under review. Now, I'm not predicting this. The political conditions don't support it right now, but it's on the map.
Okay, so let's look at the options. You've got A, further to the left, possibly Rayner's and Burnham's objectives. You've got B, which is more centrist, which is where we're at now. Or you've got C, where there's a lot more pressure from the right, either with them coming in or just pushing their views onto whatever political party's in power. What scenario are we planning for? How do we pick one?
Now I'm planning for scenario A while hoping for scenario B.
Okay.
Which is the put contract logic again. Plan for the worst realistic outcome. Operate for the most likely. Stay flexible enough to move if the picture changes.
Yeah. And for our people that are listening to the podcast today, what should they be most afraid of? Is it legislation? Is it who might come into power? Is it perhaps just the uncertainty, or probably all the above?
You know, my favorite saying, don't focus on what you can't control.
Yeah.
You control how you manage your property. You can control what you buy, what you don't buy. You control your fixed rate. If there's a fixed rate and you think, you know what, I'm uncertain for the next few years, let me grab that fixed rate. So introduce certainty from that standpoint. We can't control what the politicians do as individuals, as a group of people. Yes, we can. So that's what I would say. And people, when they're fearful, are scared of making decisions and often make the wrong ones as a result. And I'm always reminded by that American titan, J.D. Rockefeller. And he used to say, the time to buy is when the blood is running thick in the streets.
Yeah, well.
So something worth remembering.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just have a bit of a recap, because we've spent a lot of this episode maybe making our listeners a little bit more frightened of the current situation. I know honesty is the best policy. It's what we always sign up for, and that's what we want to share. But what do we do about that?
Let's be practical. Let's stop treating our portfolio as a collection of assets and start treating it as a business because the regulatory environment is now a business environment. You have compliance obligations, operating costs, a tenant relationship, and legal parameters. That is a business, and businesses that are run as businesses survive disruption much better than assets sitting there hoping for winds of change.
Yeah. And the people that are listening to this and thinking, I'm out, I'm selling.
And that's their choice. If they sell, make a profit. Nobody is going to be put in jail for selling and making an honest profit. And that's their choice. And it could be age related. It could be, I don't do stress, so therefore I'm out. And maybe they have other options. So that's absolutely fine. We know that we're in this for the long term, both from a managing and an owning standpoint. So we have to face the music. We have to face the winds of change and pivot that word again as required and plan and structure in a way that makes our business solid and enables us to serve our landlords.
Yeah. And for the people who are staying in the game, what's the move?
I think professionalize, whatever it takes, because the compliance burden of the next 3 to 5 years is going to separate the operators who can handle it from the ones who can't. And the ones who can't aren't the ones still running their portfolios like it's 2015. Our regulation agent exists because we looked at what was coming and decided that manual compliance was just not sustainable. Mabel, our maintenance platform, exists because we looked at the maintenance burden and decided that reactive management was just not a sustainable answer. We didn't build these agents because we had spare time. We built them because we could see the wall coming, and we decided we'd rather build something that we can drive into it and survive.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say in this section is that flat cap miner made a rational decision based on the world he or she understood. He trusted his industry. He trusted his union. He trusted the system that he'd built his life around and put on hold for. But it didn't. Not because he was stupid, because the world changed faster than the system he was embedded into. The landlord who bought in the 70s and held through the carnage came out the other end, not because property is magical, but because they stayed in the game with their eyes open. And I think that's the choice in front of every property investor right now. Eyes open or eyes shut. The world is going to change either way.
Wow, that's strong. I think that's a strong finish in terms of what anyone listening today should be taken away from this episode. The world is changing whether we like it or not. AI is coming whether we like it or not. Governments will change whether we like it or not. And closing your eyes and wishing it all to go away is just not the answer. In this episode, Paul, we've gone through how the private rented sector could effectively become an arm of the government, which would make me pretty sick, but there we go. A nation that is getting poorer. We've covered the discontent of the 1970s, the flat cap miner, the move to AI job displacement, what comes after the fourth turning, your put contract. We've looked at the different Labour leadership scenarios, option A, B, and C, and what to actually do about it.
We be like, that sounds like a lot.
It is a lot. I think this is probably our most honest episode. We've just shared what's going on. And what I keep coming back to is the minor question, because I think that's the one that stays with people.
Yeah, it's a question that nobody asks when they're in the middle of the storm. They ask, is this going to be okay? Is this going to pass? What do I do right now? And those are all reasonable questions. But the better question is, 50 years from now, or 10 years from now, which side of this decision do I want to have been on?
And the answer is?
The answer is the one where you stayed in the game, with your eyes open, with a plan, not hoping, but planning.
We're building an AI army, effectively, to defend ourselves. And we're defending our business, our services. We want to adapt quickly for whatever's coming, and whether that's left or centre or right, the good, the bad, or the ugly. And we want to help other people to do the same. So please continue to listen to the podcast episodes. Share them with anyone that you know that you think would benefit from listening to this. Paul has been doing a lot more social media. I've dragged him into the world of social media and he's posting. And if you're listening to this and thinking, who is Stan and Reggie and Mabel They are our AI agents that we've been building, and they have names. Stan even has a face. And if you haven't seen Paul's interview of our AI agent Stan, then head over to our YouTube channel to check that out, because that's pretty futuristic. But we're building stuff to protect, and going forward, we're being really open and honest with what we're building and what's working and what's not working. And we encourage you to follow our work. And at some point, hopefully, we'll do something together where you say, yeah, I need myself a Stan, I need myself a Reggie. And once we perfected it, not quite yet because it's still in the works, but once we perfected it, we look forward to sharing those AI agents with you moving forward. So from me, take care, everyone.
We'll see you next episode.